Third-party logistics and freight benchmarking. That's what we're talking about this week. Why? A lot of people have been asking me about it, and I'm going to explain a few different approaches coming right up. So welcome back to Supply Chain Secrets, particularly if you are new to the channel. And this week I'd like to talk a little bit about benchmarking. 3PLs, third-party logistics, freight companies. What I'm talking about kind of applies to both. And the reason I want to talk about that is that we've had a lot of our consulting clients here at Logistics Bureau talk to us this year about benchmarking. They're coming from the perspective of, we've been with this particular 3PL, we've been with these freight carriers for, X period. And we're wondering if we're getting a good deal commercially, and we'd like to do some benchmarking. And I've kind of changed my views a bit over how to do this over the years, to be honest, and we've been doing this for about 30 years. So what I'd like to do is not talk too long, but to run you through sort of 5 elements to consider when you want to benchmark your 3PL or freight rates, and some of the things to consider. And then right at the end, I'll mention 1 or 2 ways that I think are probably the best and why. So first of all, the most obvious one is to benchmark the actual rate. The cost per ton, the cost per pallet, the cost per order, whatever that might be, and compare that to similar organizations to yourself. Now, therein lies the issue, because if you're going to do a true sort of apples and apples comparison, you really need to compare your organization to a very similar one in terms of their warehousing costs or freight costs. And you need to find other organizations to measure yourself against who have similar products, servicing similar customers, with a similar geography, similar order profiles. So you can see immediately how that can be a little bit of a challenge. And look, I've been doing this sort of benchmarking for close to 30 years, and that's been a very traditional approach, and it's certainly quite useful, but you just have to be aware of the dangers in that you're not always comparing apples and apples, and the size of the organization as well, of course. If you are comparing yourself against somebody who's spending $50 million a year on freight and you're spending $2 million, well, they might be getting a better deal than you are. So again, it's not really an apples and apples comparison. But if you can get access to those freight rates and those benchmarks and the databases that have those, that's a really good way. We have access to that. I'm not saying that's necessarily the best way to do it though. Another way, so number 2, is to benchmark your warehousing costs, freight costs and other costs against others, but as a percentage of sales. So you're not looking at the particular rate structure itself. We're not measuring, you get $20 per ton delivery and somebody else is getting $30 per ton. We're looking at the aggregate cost and comparing that against similar organizations. That tends to smooth out some of these sort of irregularities or difficulties in comparing apples with apples. Not all of them, but it's a really good way, I think, to get that first initial sort of toe in the water, that initial comparison to say, compared to other organizations like ours, are we doing okay commercially, be that with our warehousing costs or freight costs? You've still got a few challenges trying to make sure that you're comparing like with like, but it's easier than actually comparing the specific rate. The rate per lane, for example, is quite difficult, but this aggregate cost, warehousing costs, freight costs as a percentage of sales, is a lot easier to access, and it gives you a fairly good indicator. So that's the second thing to think about. The third one, and I think this is really important, is to look at the rate structure. And I've mentioned this a few times on the channel. What I mean by that is not only, if you like, the way that you're paying for the service. So if we look at freight, for an example, are you paying per truckload, a full truckload, part truckload, per pallet, per ton, per carton, per delivery? So you've got to make sure that that rate structure actually suits you. And what I mean by that is, given your freight profile, look at the sensitivities of volume. What if your volume goes down? What if it goes up? Is it still in your favor? So that's really important. But also you need to, and I've mentioned this before very recently, The other thing to look at in your freight profile is where your sort of average consignment size is. Not even average, the most common consignment size. And without repeating everything in that video, I'll put the link to it down below where I talk about this. You imagine that you've got freight going out as cartons, as pallets, and as full truckloads. You may have a really good freight rate for pallets, individual pallets, so you've got a great pallet rate. But what if 90% is going out as cartons? Or what if 80% is going out as full truckloads? It almost becomes irrelevant. So you've got to make sure that the individual rate is good, but that it matches your freight profile as well. So have a look at the rate structure, not strictly benchmarking, but I think when people say to me, you know, we're looking at trying to assess how competitive our costs are to the market, it's still a really important thing to look at. Look at the rate structure. The fourth one is just to do some basic market research. And we're doing that for a couple of clients at the moment, whereby, you know, they're thinking, oh, our 3PL costs are going up a little bit. What's a good way of checking that? So in conjunction with benchmarking, you might want to have a look at some market research and look at things. So for warehousing, for example, look at availability of warehousing space. You know, what's the industrial real estate market look like at the moment? I'm based in Sydney, Australia. The costs have gone up a huge amount in recent years, crazy amount, you know, unbelievable. So you need to have an understanding of that, so that when your 3PL's coming for an increase in rates, or, you know, suddenly your costs are going up, you kind of understand why that is. So things like commercial rents, what are they looking like? Industrial rents. Also looking at labour costs, you know, fuel costs. So you need that basic understanding of how industry trends and costs are going as well. So that's number 4 to think about. And then number 5, it's something that still quite a few people do, is they go to the market. And what do I mean by that? They use putting out a request for tender or a request for proposal, request for quotation, as a kind of benchmarking exercise. So before we renew our contract, we're going to go to the market, we're going to invite some other suppliers to quote. I have problems with that, to be honest. Firstly, there's a lot of work involved in it. It depends what your objective is. If you are serious about potentially changing suppliers, okay, it's a pretty valid approach. You want to see what else is out there, you want to see what the other offerings are. If you're using it merely to check on your incumbent supplier, I really have problems with that. And because it's a huge amount of work for everybody involved to put these quotes together. And you're asking suppliers to spend a lot of time, resource and money in putting a quote together where you're not even serious about, you know, changing suppliers. I've got a big issue with that, I'm sorry. It's a big ethical issue. If you're genuinely wanting to test the market and if you get a good offer, you're going to change, that's fine. But I still see quite a lot of people doing it as a benchmarking exercise. So don't put people through the ringer. And look, suppliers are not stupid. They can smell a rat. If they think it's a benchmarking exercise, guess what? They're not going to put the effort in. You're not going to get the responses that you're looking for. They're going to be reluctant. You're going to get hastily put together responses. You know, some will put the time in, but others won't. So yeah, I think you get the message. So there's 5 sort of things to think about if you want to check your outsourced warehousing costs, your 3PL costs, your freight costs, again, outsourced freight costs, different kettle of fish, of course, internally. So those 5 things to think about. You might want to benchmark the actual rates. You might want to look at your costs as a percentage of sales compared to similar organisations. You're going to need some sort of access to a benchmarking database. You might want to look, thirdly, at the rate structure and whether that suits your order profiles, your freight profiles. You might want to do some broader research at number 4 to assess where the industry is headed in terms of costs. And 5th, you might want to go to the market with an RFQ, RFP, and so on. What would I recommend? So I did say right at the beginning of this, I would recommend what I think is the most effective. And I'm going to mention 2. One is benchmarking as a percentage of sales. I think that's a really good initial way to see whether you're in the ballpark or not with what you're paying for particular services. It's a lot easier to do, a lot less expensive to do. We do it lots of times. And the other thing that you might want to do in conjunction with that is to look at the rate structure. So whether that be for warehousing or for freight, look at how you are paying for that service, how that rate structure is put together. So for example, we talked about freight. For warehousing, it might be a container destuffing charge, it might be a receipt charge per pallet, it could be put away charges, it could be all that activity-based costing, it could be the cost for processing an order. Look at how that cost is being charged to you and whether that makes sense in terms of your products and your order profiles. So that's the two that I think are really worthwhile looking at first: benchmarking as a percentage of sales and the rate structures. So have you gone through some sort of a benchmarking exercise? How do you test now and again that your commercial arrangements for outsourced warehousing or freight are fair and that you're comfortable? Do you go to the market? Do you do benchmarking? How else do you talk to colleagues in the industry? Do comment down below. If you have any questions about going through this sort of thing, do comment down below. And I'll also put my contact details in the description under the video, because if you want some more advice on how to do this, I'm more than happy to help. So you can book a call and we'll have a chat. But thanks for watching. Benchmarking of warehousing and freight costs is a particularly hot topic right at the moment. Bye for now.